Welcome to another episode of the Dialectic at Work, a podcast dedicated to understanding Marxian theory, its politics, its philosophy, and its economics. I'm your host, Shahram Azhar. I'm Associate Professor of Economics at Bucknell University. If the first volume of Capital is the most famous and widely read, and if the second is the unknown one, the third is the most controversial. So wrote Ernest Mundell in his preface to the third volume of Capital. In the last episode, we discussed with Professor Rick Wolff the idea of Volume 3, what it entails, why Marx wrote Volume 3, why Engels thought it was so important to publish it before he passed away. And in this episode, we're going to devote our attention to the following question: what is the transformation problem? This is something that has generated enormous excitement around the world, particularly in critics of Marx who thought, as we will see in this particular episode, that this meant the end of Karl Marx's system. With me to make sense of all of this is Professor Richard Wolff. How are you, Rick?
Okay, Shahram, glad to be here.
Rick, I really wanted to utilize every second of this particular episode and wanted to ask you the following question: what is the difference between value and price? Are these two words synonyms in economics, in which case we can just get rid of one of them? Or do they mean something qualitatively different? Can you please help us understand that?
Okay. Um, your question is more important than most people, I think, realize. It's not about what it has been cracked up to be. It's not about prices. It's not about value as a kind of alternative way of understanding economics. It's not about value as a way of understanding why prices are what they are. None of that. It is a different way of thinking about economics. Value theory approaches the question, what is an economy? How does it work? Differently from the way people approach it whose focus is on prices. So let me unpack that. Neoclassical economics, that's the dominant economic theory in the world today. It's the theory that I was taught at Harvard, Stanford, and Yale, where I had my education in modern economics. That was the only basic theory they taught. Keynesian economics, which they did give some attention to, was an addendum, was another bit of analysis, but the core ideas were what we call neoclassical economics. And they were concerned with prices. And by prices, they meant the way goods and services exchanged in markets. In other words, you pay $4 for this ice cream cone, you pay $30 for this software program. Those are its prices of these goods. They are the exchange values, what you get when you exchange the property you own for something else. That other thing could be somebody else's property in the form of goods or services or in the form of money. Those are prices. Now, neoclassical economics wants to understand the economy as a whole. Everything. The distribution of income, the rate of growth, the utilization of technology. It wants to understand all of those and other aspects of an economy through the lens, through the approach, first and foremost, what are the prices of an economy? Now, you might wonder, and you should, why would people start with prices? And that has to do with the history of capitalism and of economic systems even before capitalism. I'm now going to summarize those in a terribly simplifying way so we can get to the core, which is what Marx's value theory has to do with all of this price theory. So here's my thumbnail history. Once upon a time, long ago, human beings lived either in isolated family units, farms, we call them, peasant households, if you like, or they lived in small villages where everybody took care of their own needs, or they had a village economy, which with a division of labor. This one made the bread, that one took care of the chickens, this one made pots and pans, whatever, and then they exchanged at the end. Either way, it was very clear to people that your effort, what you put out as your effort, your brains, your muscles, would produce a certain amount of chicken, care for, eggs, a certain amount of grain, a certain amount of shirts, a certain amount of fill in the blank. There was a clear understanding what it took out of you as a working person to produce whatever it was that you consumed. Whether you consumed your own product or you consumed another person's product, giving that person whatever you produced in exchange for some of what the other one produced. The relationship was clear between work effort and result, labor and output, work and consumption of output. But then, as societies grew and became more complicated, the division of labor spread, and we now had an enormous change. We didn't, in the main, produce for ourselves most of what we consumed, nor did we live in little villages where we knew our neighbor from whom we got a few of those things we didn't produce for ourselves. No, in modern society, and we all take it for granted now, we work, we get money, and we go to a store where we exchange money for all the goods, clothing, shelter, food that we need to consume. So suddenly something becomes important that wasn't important before, namely the ratio of exchange between whatever it is we produce and all those other things we're going to exchange our product for. So let me give you an example. Suppose I grow potatoes, and every year I work very hard. I clear the field, I weed it, I fertilize it, I water it, I do all the work, and I accumulate X bushels of potatoes at the end of the harvest. Now I'm going to exchange them for the clothing, for the pots and pans, for the shingles of my house, for the toys of my children, whatever. I'm going to exchange my potatoes, that's what I got, for all those other things. Maybe I'll sell my potatoes for money and then use the money to buy all those other things. But what's going to be really important for me, which never was before, not about my labor, I understand all about that, not about what I get out of those goods and services I buy, I understand that, I eat the ice cream cone, I wear the shirt, but I got a new mystery, the exchange ratio between what I produce, potatoes, and everything else. So one year I work real hard, I produce potatoes, but in the market, in the exchange process, nobody gives a crap about my potatoes. I don't get much money. I can't buy anything. I starved to death. I had no way to survive. I am very interested to understand what determines the price. I have to be. My life, my future, my condition, my survival depend on this mysterious market where goods and services exchange, and all my labor may come to nothing if my potato isn't worth much. On the other hand, I could become super rich if my potato becomes very valuable. What determines the value of my potato really is the question: what determines the price? People in that idiom, thinking that way, use the words value and price interchangeably because that's what's meaningful to them. That's what they want to understand, the mystery of price. Try to put yourself in the position of the human beings that went through what I've just described. They were. This is a mystery as profoundly important to them as birth or death or a violent storm or any other great event that human beings have found mysterious. Religion is a way of coping with the mysteries of life and death. Economics is a way of coping with the mystery of the market and of price. Okay.
Wow.
Now, what is Marx? Marx is a different theory. Was Marx aware of the big thinking about price? Yes. If you understood what I just told you in the last 6 or 7 minutes, I got that from Marx. He taught me what it was that his predecessors were obsessing about because he wanted to underscore that that was not his agenda. That was not for him important. He understood why it was important to everybody else. He assumed that those people who had studied price, had learned a bunch of things. They had, for example, learned that you could understand price at least a little bit by understanding the things we now call supply and demand, that there were all these conditions that led people to want a shirt. And then there were all these other conditions that led other people to make shirts and to offer them in exchange. And the relationship between the buyers and the sellers had something to do with what the price eventually was as they bargained with each other over the exchange. He got all that. But he said, and this is so important, that's not my concern. I look at this system in a different way. I'm not interested in how the price is shaped. I'm interested in how human beings interact with one another in the process of producing and exchanging goods and services. They're not these others. I am. So I'm interested, and not only that, I have a particular point of view. I am interested in labor. I'm interested in that business they're not that interested in. Because if you're interested in price, the labor is over. You're dealing with the object that comes out of the labor. But the labor is over when you have the object, right? When you have the potato, all the work in the land has been done. You're not interested in that. That is for you another person's object of analysis, not yours. You're dealing with the price. No, Marx says that. I understand that. If I were interested in what the exchange rates were, then I would be with you. But I'm not. I'm not. I'm interested in labor. And why was Marx interested in labor? Because he had of feeling based on his other work. Remember, Capital is not Marx's early work. Capital is Marx's late work. It's work he's done from the time he becomes politically conscious in the 1840s, and he's working on the Communist Manifesto, and he's working on the revolutions of 1848 and all the turmoil in Europe as capitalism replaces feudalism. He's caught up in all of that in that part of the border between Germany and France, where he's born and where he grows up. So he had already come to the conclusion that capitalism was deficient. And it was deficient in a way that affected him deeply personally. Why? Marx's generation, I think we've talked about this in earlier episodes, celebrated the French Revolution, thought that liberty, equality, fraternity were the great slogans of modern society. And remember, Marx grew up in a Germany that was just coming to terms with those ideas. A Germany still disunified into many little feudal society. It had not yet been unified by Bismarck into one country. So for him, these anti-feudal slogans, liberty, equality, fraternity, were wonderful. He loved them. And he loved capitalism as the new system, abolishing serfdom, abolishing the obligations of the serf to the lord of the land, and all of that, for him were progress. And he embraced it with the enthusiasm of his generation. And as I think I said before, if you ever want to feel that, listen to Beethoven symphonies, because that's his contemporary who wrote those symphonies to express those feelings. Anyway, so Marx says, capitalism has betrayed me. Capitalism isn't bringing liberty, equality, and fraternity, because here I am in the 1840s and 50s, first on the continent, then in London. And remember, if you want to understand what Marx saw in London at the time he gets there, then remember, or if you haven't read them, read the novels of Charles Dickens. They are descriptors of London at that time. So remember Oliver Twist or A Christmas Carol or Tale of Two Cities. Those are the books that will give you Marx's environment. Very obvious to Marx, as it was to Dickens, that liberty, equality, and fraternity would not have been the words that spring to anybody's mind looking at England at that time. If anything, it would have been the opposite. Marx asks himself, what happened? How did we get the end of feudalism, Ray, and the slogans liberty and equality and fraternity and democracy, Ray, and we get this, which is the opposite? I'm going to understand it, and I think I have an idea. We thought we had overcome the slaveries of the past. We thought we had overcome the feudalisms of the nearer past, but we hadn't. There's something that stinks in modern capitalism. It stinks of the residue of slavery and feudalism. And what is horrible about slavery and feudalism is the way the bulk of the labor is done by a class that doesn't get to enjoy its fruits. And the fruits are enjoyed by a class that doesn't have to work. And you know what? Capitalism never escaped from that dichotomy. It doesn't have slaves and masters. It doesn't have lords and serfs. But it has employers and employees. And I suspect there we will find the clue to what I want to explain, which is not why goods have a certain price, but why our society hasn't given us liberty, equality, fraternity. And the answer is in the organization of work, because there capital looks alarmingly like slavery and feudalism. With that in his head, he then says, I'm going to look at society and I'm going to say that the way to think about it has actually been figured out by the people who uncritically, well, no, I take that back, who understand and like capitalism despite its flaws. Smith and Ricardo. Because as the champions of the capitalism coming in to replace the feudalism being overthrown, they did have insights into what they loved. And the insight, which is what helped them to get rid of feudalism in their mind, was that everything that gets produced, everything that's adorning the chateau of the Lord, that clothing that his wife and children wear in great, all of that, the food they eat, the toilet they use is produced and cleaned by the workers, just like in feudalism, just like in slavery, and in capitalism too. The big employers have the big houses full of the servants, and they consume everything. So I'm going to use the following idea. Everything that gets produced has in it a certain, here we go now, value. What is that value? It's the value is the share of the laboring capacity that the whole community has that's embodied in that thing. There's a certain amount that we have. We only have in our community 50 people or 500 people or 5 million people. It doesn't matter. We have a finite number of people in the economy we're analyzing. And if you allocate 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, or whatever the metric would be, that's the amount of labor we have. We can only produce what these people's labor enables us to produce. Therefore, everything that gets produced has in it a share of the labor capability we have. And it is valuable because, in a way, that's going to explain to us how the system works. We're going to be able to understand, oh, yeah, half of our people are doing this. This. We don't have to have this. If half the people were doing something else, we could have something else. But what we got has to depend on allocating the labor in a certain way. If they consume 9/10 of the grain, well then, 9/10 of us are working for them. Do we want that? Does that mean that if we didn't work for them, we could be working for us? My God. And Marx, has an epiphany. My guess is he had quite a few with his friend Fred, after they had had too many beers or whatever they drank. He liked Margaux, the French wine. So too many Margauxs. So here's my point. Marx's analysis looks at an economy as a way, here we go now, of organizing the utilization of the labor available in any economic system. Because that's what he's interested in. He's He's a revolutionary. He wants to organize the labor differently. He wants to show people, here's this radicalism. Look at what we could do with this labor. Look at what we are doing, and now ask the logical question, couldn't we do it differently? And of course, the answer is yes. And who has to decide to do that? You, he screams at the workers. Without you, none of it works. You have the power. You're not waiting to get it. You already have it. Now, use it. And that's been the revolutionary message to this day. So value theory isn't about explaining prices. That's not its purpose. That's not its function. Can you do that? Sure. You can. By sure, I mean, is there a relationship between the value analysis of a capitalist system and the prices you see in the market? Yes. And in volume 3, Marx begins. He doesn't do all of it because there's no point in doing such a detail. He opens up, here's how you would look at that. Here's how you'd see how the values play a role in shaping the prices. He didn't tell you the other part, but which his logic requires us to say, that prices also shape values. Why? Because there's no one-way causation in Marx's work. In the Grundrisse and elsewhere, as a student of Hegel, he makes his commitment to that idea that everything interacts with everything else, that there are no one-way lines of causation, so that you shouldn't then import that anti-Marxian idea into your analysis of capital. It just means you haven't understood what Marx is about, nor his relationship to Hegel, which, of course, how could they, since they didn't read the Marx, they didn't even know that to understand Marx, if I can quote Lenin, you have to understand Hegel. I think Lenin went a little far, but you can see what Lenin is trying to convey. It helps you get what Marx is about if you read Lenin. And if you're wondering, any of you, what you want to read is something called the Conspectus on Hegel. That's what Lenin called it. Go look for that in the collected works of Lenin, and you will see it's a long, detailed commentary by Lenin on certain of Hegel's works that he felt were crucial to understanding Marxism. So the point is to see these as alternative theories, if you like modern language, different paradigms whose entry points into understanding the economy are different. One approach focuses on exchange and the ratios of prices in the markets where exchange occurs. The other one focuses on the allocation of labor in society with a specific focus on the differentiation between necessary labor and surplus labor, which are the logical next steps when you begin with a focus on labor. So don't look for an equation that relates value to price. If you want one, take a look at the work that I did with two others, Bruce Roberts and Antonio Calari. You'll find that in the literature. The literature is vast, but Marx only begins by showing you how you can see the values in the prices. But this is not the project. Don't look for a project that Marx didn't. It's as if you said Marx had very little to say about the whooping cough. You're right. On the whooping cough, Marx is useless, but he wasn't interested in the whooping cough. It's as if you handed in a paper in your economics class and the teacher berated you for not understanding Freud's notion of the unconscious. It's nowhere in the paper, and you have to explain to the professor, yes, but you're an economics professor. That wasn't covered in the class. This is a conversation between idiots. Let's not go there.
Rick, I wanted to ask you, you kind of briefly mentioned it already. You, Steve, and Bruce Roberts, this friend of ours and your former student, devoted your attention to what has been called in the literature the transformation problem. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you guys wrote an article about this called Ricardo, not Marx's transformation problem. Um, can you help us? Can you help us understand what you, Steve, and Bruce discussed? How you arrived at that particular conclusion? What was that conclusion, and how did you guys deal with the critiques surrounding the transformation problem?
Okay, I can give you some of that conversation. Um, it goes back to something I believe you and I discussed in the segment before this one. We in America were very influenced by Paul Sweezy. And Paul Sweezy's classic book that many of us learned from, and that many of us, myself included, used at least in the early years of our careers when we were professors and teachers. So our students also went through it. He has a section which he calls the transformation problem. And what Sweezy does there, and I had to learn this later. Sweezy was someone I worked with personally, so I was able to ask him questions and so on. Um, Sweezy had gone to Germany as a young man, as many Americans did, because the German system was full of Marxists at that time in the way that the American system was not. The quality of German education was higher than that of the United States along almost any metric you can pick. And so, like many, he went to Germany. In Germany, he encountered the work of numbers of Marxists who were important in shaping his thinking, but he was also introduced to the work of a Polish economist, von Bortkiewicz by name. And if you're interested, you can find Bortkiewicz in the library. You can look it up in Sweezy's book. He tells you about it a little bit. Bortkiewicz was a Ricardian economist who posed the question of volume 3 the way I have just now said it wasn't. In other words, he wanted to show that Marx's theory was, if you understood it in a certain way, perfectly compatible with and translatable with, in a very simple way, price theory. In other words, trying to rehabilitate Marxism by showing that it was like price theory, as if that would be an adequate demonstration. And Sweezy thought Bortkiewicz had done it. And so he presented Bortkiewicz's solution to demonstrate that Marx is perfectly on target, thinking that values are a perfectly analogous way to understand prices, as is conventional price theory. We wanted to explain, and that's why it has that title, that what Sweezy had done is accepted Bortkiewicz, which is much more consistent with Ricardo than it is with Marx. If you interpret Marx in this Ricardian way, well, then yes, but that loses you the Marxism. So what you've gained is not worth what you've lost. Okay? Now, how to say this in another language? As we said in a much earlier episode, the labor theory of value, which most of my professors attributed to Marx, shouldn't be. Marx did not invent the labor theory of value. Absolutely not. That credit goes at least to Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and probably to earlier thinkers from whom they got the idea. But it certainly exists in Adam Smith, and Adam Smith is at the end of the 18th century, and Marx doesn't really arrive until the 19th century. So clearly, if you want to deal with the labor theory of value, you start with Adam Smith or earlier. Number two, Adam Smith's labor theory was found to be very important, very useful, very acceptable in most developments, except Ricardo had problems with it, and Ricardo changed it a bit to make it work better in Ricardo's view to analyze capitalism. So now already we have two labor theories of value, Smith's and Ricardo's. Why am I telling you this? Because Marx's was yet again different. Marx's labor theory of value is what I gave you 10 minutes ago. That's not Ricardo, and that's not Adam Smith, right? Adam Smith really felt it was, to quote him, the toil and trouble, and that's not Marx. If you take the aggregate, yes, the total value is the toil and trouble, the whole, but each element in the system, that depends on where the surplus is produced and where it's realized. And as we talked last time, that's not the same place. That depends on technology, that depends on the average rate of profit, and all the other things that Marx's totality, volume 3, explores. So in that way, we had to show people we can solve the problem. Sweezy already showed it, Bortkiewicz showed it, but we don't want to take the Ricardian interpretation, because that means you think that the whole point is to explain prices. It isn't. And then I play a game with my students. If you allow me, let me do it here. I like to make hay out of the following fact. Do you really care why the price of hairbrushes is what it is? No, because you're not any more enthralled by the mystery of price. You're really more interested in what Marx was interested in, the human relationships that this system imposes on us. That I have to walk every day to my job in the office, the factory, or the store, and I enter into a place where democracy has been excluded. The boss tells me what to do. If the boss doesn't like me, he tells me to get lost, takes my job, takes my income, jeopardizes my family, jeopardizes the community, which depends on my family buying its grocery. What? Marx is interested. What's going on here? Why do we have this? We got rid of slavery. It was unbearable. We got rid of feudalism. Now it turns out we got to get rid of this too. And for the same reason. Of course, students are more interested in that. That's like saying, which is more interesting, sex or a cheese sandwich? Hopefully, you've got that in your mind, and you don't sit there puzzling it out. Gee, cheese sandwich, sex, no. And if you can't admit which of them is more important, then you've got much bigger problems than either Marxian theory or anybody else can handle.
Wow. So in other words, I feel like the problem with contemporary economic thought and economic reasoning is that not only are they unaware of Karl Marx's works, they're also ignorant of Adam Smith and David Ricardo.
Yes.
Which is why they keep coming up with these weird kind of ideas which have nothing to do with Marx, which actually Adam Smith and Ricardo have addressed 100, 150 years earlier.
Yeah.
because we have about 20 minutes and we've devoted the first half an hour to the first controversy in volume 3, i.e., the transformation problem. I wanted to discuss with you in the remainder, about 15 minutes, this idea of the tendency for the rate of profit to fall. This is a second thematic that has generated um excitement as well as controversy. Some people, some Marxian economists think that this is the crisis tendency and this is the essentialist kind of way via which capitalism is going to end. So you and I don't really have to do anything in that particular case. Whereas others kind of say that this is a part of Marxian economics that we can ignore. Um, can you help us understand the significance of this idea, the tendency for the rate of profit to fall? How important is it for Marxian analysts to understand and appreciate its significance? Could you help us understand that?
I will try. It's important on several levels. Let me begin this way. Marx, I am quite sure, is responding in that section of volume 3, if I'm remembering chapters 13, 14, and 15, or something like that. He's responding to literature around him. Remember that a very popular idea that's already present in Smith and Ricardo, but was in the general life of the intellectuals of Europe at that time, was something that had a different name, known as, quote, the stationary state. There was in the literature the notion that capitalism might be afflicted with a tendency to run out of gas, to stop being dynamic, to stop growing, to kind of slow down until it rotted and it reached a stationary state, in the sense you're not moving anymore. And this was understood to be very, very dangerous. And it was understood in a simplistic way. Why dangerous? Well, the assumption was population was growing. People worried about that all the time. Remember Malthus. If the population was growing, that meant people needing a job was growing. And if the system came to a stationary state and wouldn't be growing, it wouldn't be providing the new additional jobs for the babies that were growing up. And that would make for a lot of unhappy babies. And when they're grown up, they can throw stones. So you got a problem here, number one. So Marx is saying, this is in the air. I've got to deal with this to show people how a Marxist goes about thinking about that. And remember, volume 3 also shows how a Marxist goes about thinking about banking and credit. How do you account for interest rates? What's the relationship of the interest rates people, borrowers pay, and the production and distribution of surplus? Marx teaches what I just said, answers the question in volume 3. He does the same for landlords and rent. He does the same thing for merchants and the income merchants get, and so forth. So he addresses issues he knows to be of interest to economists, and one of them is this tendency of capitalism to go to a stationary state. Notice again, Marx is not the origin of the notion of a tendency to go down and to have slow or no growth. That's already in the literature. Smith, Ricardian, and countless others talk about it. So this is just Marx saying, here's how I look at it. The first thing then to note is that unlike other people, Marx, the Hegelian scholar, wants you to understand that all this is a tendency about which no sooner have you laid it out and shown this is going on in capitalism, you have to ask two questions always. One, are there counter tendencies? And number two, are there contradictions in the tendency? And the answer to number two is always yes, because that's what Hegelians do. That's how they think. You don't have to think like that. But if you're going to do work with Marx, and you know Marx is the student of Hegel and a very appreciative one, well, then you have no excuse to not do, except if you're ignorant of Hegel. And there we go. That's our profession. You know, they can't spell Hegel, let alone tell you what it's about. Okay, so now let's do it. Because Marx, being smart, he knows there is a tendency, but he also knows we haven't realized capitalism has been growing, not steadily, not evenly, but it's been growing. So clearly, hint, there's probably either a counter tendency or a contradiction within the tendency, or maybe both. Turns out there's both. And he's going to give each of them a chapter. So there's the tendency chapter, then the next chapter, counteracting tendencies, and the third chapter, contradictions, or maybe he does the contradictions and then the counter. It doesn't matter. Either is okay. All right? So one of the things he shows is that the very technological development that turns the rate of profit, and think of it this way, the technology is often, not always, but is often capital using. In other words, more and more machines per person. Okay, that's going to lower the profit. You got to buy more and more machines for the same worker to work with. You only get surplus out of a worker. You don't get it out of a machine. So the more machines you use for each worker, the more the surplus the worker produces is the numerator, what you get as a capitalist, but the denominator, what you have to lay out, is expensive because you got all the machine. You know, this is not rocket science. So the rate of profit is going to fall as you become more capital intensive in your technology. Yes, he says, but if you use more technology, you also lower the value per unit of output. And if the output in question are those machines, well, then yes, you add machines, but your denominator, the value doesn't go up because there's less value in each machine because the technology enables you to do that. Again, this really isn't, even if my just saying it take you a moment to figure it out, but think about it, you'll see that's the law. In other words, inside the very growth of machinery is the economy and the amount of capital you need per unit output that negates itself, that undercuts it. And by the way, Sweezy in his book shows this. Other people do too. There's no excuse for not seeing this. And then to give you an example of the counter tendencies, he says, well, yeah, okay, so you're using more capital, but maybe if the Europe in the 19th century, what was Europe doing in the 19th century? What Europe was doing the whole 19th century was ripping the hell out of its colonies. Whether it's South Asia or Africa, or it was getting, every time it looked to find a cheaper source of iron or a cheaper source of aluminum or a cheaper source later on of petroleum or a cheaper, and that by economizing on the cost of an input would raise your rate of profit and therefore operate as a counter tendency to the decline coming from technology. All he's doing is weaving together the different influences to show you that there is a tendency, true enough, but there are contradictions and counter tendencies, so that at any moment it could go any which way. So if you find a period of 11 years when the rate of profit is going up, you haven't refuted Marx, you idiot. You haven't read it, is your problem. Otherwise, you would have said, oh, let's see, given Marx's analysis, how would he or how would a Marxist account for this period when the rate of profit doesn't go down but goes up? And you know what you'll find? That they did have rising capital per worker, but the counteracting tendencies or the contradictions overwhelmed the tendency. That's why he calls it a tendency. You know, the number of people who don't get that word or don't understand the English meaning of that word is sad. By the way, one of our students, one of Steve and my students, named Stephen Cullenberg, Cullenberg, he wrote a book published. I can't remember who the publisher was. I believe a publisher in Great Britain wrote a book on the tendency for the rate of profit to fall. It develops what I've just summarized in excruciating detail because he wanted to nail this problem down. He wrote his doctoral dissertation on this subject and then developed it into this book. Anyone interested in this whole approach, you cannot do better than getting a hold of the book by Stephen, with a PH, Stephen Cullenberg.
Thank you, Rick. The book's name is The Falling Rate of Profit Recasting the Marxian Debate by Stephen Cullenberg, published by the Pluto Press. It's available on Amazon, guys. This is a very, very useful book. Rick, we have about 8 minutes, and I'm going to ask you a rather speculative question, because a lot of Gen Z folks have asked me they're really interested in this kind of stuff, apparently. When you look at the world of artificial intelligence and some of these technical changes that are taking place in the world today, some people speculate that we might move to a world where all the labor in a Jetsons kind of a world is automated. You know, that old cartoon that we used to watch as kids. Gen Z kids have asked me to ask you the following question: how does the professor look at these tendencies? Do you see them as confirming Marx's analysis in some way or the other? Are you optimistic about the future of technology and its ability to help us eliminate the contradictions within capitalism? What's your take on artificial intelligence and the possibility of a future? How do you look at this?
Let me answer it in a way that may surprise you. I have a number of friends who are activists in something called the animal rights movement. They've been active for many years. They believe that animals are very badly treated in our society, that animals have all kinds of feelings, emotional states, whatever you want to call it. They are sensitive, and that we, the human race, are very insensitive, cruel, and unnecessarily destructive of animals. I find much of that persuasive, but obviously I'm not an animal rights activist, and I do have problems because they often represent themselves as speaking for the animals, at which point they lose me. I can't see that. And I've asked myself, what happened? How do I account for these people? Good people, nice people, well-meaning people. Something happened at some point, and I know enough of them personally that this is my guess. They discovered, to their shock, that feeling empathy, sympathy for oppressed human beings gets you into all kinds of trouble. They weren't prepared to go there because it would have alienated them from their family, from their friends, from their jobs, from their futures. But they weren't prepared to give it up. They found a midpoint. They found what psychologists might call displacement, where they could put all of their empathy, their revolutionary ardor to change, to free the animals from the awful treatment to which they are subjected. It was a way to displace a feeling about their fellow human beings where it would be less dangerous, less costly. They would pay the price that it looks to a lot of people a little weird, but weird is not dangerous the way a political revolutionary has to deal with. Okay, why am I telling you this story? Marx's work has been assimilated to, reduced to, associated with economic determinism and technological determinism, as if it were Marx's view that in the end there is a determining core of the system. It's either the economy or it's technology, or maybe some connection between them. That is an interpretation of Marx. If you are of that persuasion, and if particularly you think of it in terms of technology, well, then the last 150 or 200 years have been very good for you, because we've had one big technological breakthrough after another. You know, the loom, the ability to weave cloth on a massive scale, as we know from the economic history of Britain, transformed Britain, created the British Empire, created South Asia to produce cotton, and Egypt and the American South. I mean, shaped the modern world in countless ways. And then there were the breakthroughs of iron and steel, the breakthrough of modern chemistry, the breakthrough of electricity, the breakthrough of atomic energy, the breakthrough of the computer, the breakthrough of the robot, the breakthrough of artificial intelligence. I've left many out, but you get the idea. Each of them has persuaded some people, including Marxists or folks close to Marxism, that here was the big one, the one that changed the whole basic story, the narrative we tell about capitalism. Well, you can already tell where I'm going. I don't think so. I think technological determinism is a mistake. It's a mistake because it's a determinism. The problem here is not that technology isn't important. It is. Technology changes everything, but so does everything else, each in its own way. And I'm not going to weigh the influence of technology against the influence of culture, because those are incommensurable. You can't reduce these qualitatively different parts of society to some quantitative measure that they're both reducible to. That's the problem. One isn't more important, they're different. They relate differently to one another and to the rest of society. That's the important insight. And let me do it now one more way. Every technological breakthrough can be handled with the following parable that comes right out of Marx. And this is true whether you talk about electricity or atomic energy or mechanical energy, AI, it doesn't matter. Here we go. Imagine a technical breakthrough that makes workers twice as productive as they used to be. Now imagine an enterprise with 100 workers. The employer pays the 100 workers whatever their salary is. The employer buys the inputs they work on, and he buys the machines they work with. And they produce an output which the employer sells for a revenue. He uses the revenue to replace the tools and equipment he used up. He uses the revenue to pay the wages of the workers, right? And he uses the remainder as the surplus he realizes for himself. Now he buys the machine that makes his workers twice as productive, or the new electric gadget, or the AI, whatever. It doesn't matter. Why does he do it? The answer is simple. Let's assume he fires half of his workers. He no longer has 100, he only has 50. The 50 with the new whatever, AI, robot, doesn't matter. The 50 produce exactly as much as the 100 used to. He pays them the same, the 50, the same salary they got before. He has the same output. He sells it. He makes the same revenue, right? He replaces the tools and equipment. But now he has an advantage. He needs only half of what he used to use to pay the wages because he fired half his workers. So wages for 50 workers that he fired, he keeps for himself. His profits, therefore, in this business have gone way up. And so, of course, he buys that technology. He installs it. Now, what does Marx teach us? Marx teaches us there was another option. In the second option, the employer, faced with the same new technology, robot, AI, electricity, chemistry, whatever, keeps 100 workers, doesn't fire anybody. He simply says to those workers, your workday is now 4 hours long, not 8. I'm going to pay you exactly what I paid before, but now for 4 hours a day, because in 4 hours a day, you can produce as much as you used to produce in 8 hours because you got this new machine. He produces the same output, sells it, makes the same revenue, replaces the used up tools and equipment, pays the workers just like he used to. He has the same profit he used to. What was the beneficiary of employing the machine, the new technology? Answer: a fantastic improvement in the leisure of 100 workers. 100 workers benefited from this technology in ways that will transform the culture. 4 hours a day they have to be with their loved ones, their children, their hobbies, their intellectual pursuits. Lord knows what they're going to invent in that time. And they're the majority. So what capitalism does is it says we're going to let new technology be installed by the employer class and nobody else. And they're going to install it in the way that's best for them and nobody else. And they're going to do it the way I just laid out. And it's going to make a big profit for them, and they're going to be very happy. And to the workers, they're going to give that famous symbol that all capitalists give their workers, whether they're aware of it or not: an upraised middle finger. Is it necessary? No. Is it intrinsic in the technology? No. All the fake moaning and groaning that AI will replace millions of... It's as if it's the AI doing something. I make you a bet. Take the AI, put it on a table, and ask it to do something. It won't do anything.
Wow.
It can't. You have to plug it in. You have to give it the input. Otherwise, it's used. This is a game. Don't be fooled. The technology changes things, no question. But the really interesting thing for Marxism is this: what does it change, and for whom, and for whose benefit? That's the important question. Not only that, think for a minute, and now let your mind go. It's like an exercise that comes out of this conversation. Try to think imaginatively of all the inventions you could imagine that would not be installed because they wouldn't enhance the profit of a capitalist, even though they could transform the life of his employees. Once you do that exercise, you'll be a much better revolutionary than you are now.
Thank you, Rick. Technology is great, folks, but as long as it remains constrained by the logic of capital, it's highly unlikely that it's going to be used for the benefit of the vast majority of the working people of the world. All right, guys, we've run out of time. I hope you got something out of it. I'll see you all in the next episode. Take care, guys.